Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 27 of Vassals of Kingsgrave's Agatha Christie Reread. Today we're covering the iconic book And Then There Were None, originally published in 1939. My name is Bina 007, and I will be your host today. And I welcome back to the podcast Hannah.
Hi, it's Winged Shadow on the Discord.
And we welcomed her, the Agatha Christie cast for the first time, Bing.
Hi, I was very long time ago, Shiner in the forums, but just being now.
And we'll be joined by 2.0, aka Pat, a little bit later on. Bing, as this is your first time on the Agatha Christie cast, maybe it's worth telling the listeners, are you a big Christie fan in general, or is it just something about this book in particular?
So yeah, I was sort of in a pre-chat talking about this a little bit, but yeah, I'm actually not that big of a Christie head. I don't know what you guys call this, her fandom these days. I've read, I think, 3 books by her, this one, and I think Death on the Nile, the Oriental, the train one. Sorry. Again, this just sort of shows my lack of familiarity with her oeuvre, if you will. But this book is a little bit different in that. So I read this book for English class in middle school, which for some reason none of the other books I read for that class left a very strong impression on me, and I wasn't very good in that class. But this book spoke to me, which I don't know. First of all, I don't know if you should be assigning this book for middle school kids.
I was just going to say, that's amazing.
Yeah. And second of all, what does that say about me that I took very strongly to this book? And I'm not generally a big mystery novel fan in general, so it's not really a problem with Agatha Christie, but just generally this is not my genre. But I really like this book, even today, beyond just a nostalgia fact, because it doesn't really read much like a mystery book. It's almost a thriller, I guess. That's my interpretation.
And I think that's right. I think there's lots of people who love this book because it is a very dark, mysterious thriller, and it isn't typical of a lot of other Agatha Christie. So I think it's perfectly possible to love this book and not read all the Miss Marples or whatever. Hannah, why don't you talk us through your relationship with this book? Because I know this is absolutely one of your favorite.
Well, before I say that, I will preface being while you were talking, I tried to look up what does an Agatha Christie mega fan call oneself, and it yielded no results. But I would have to say Christyites or Christophiles, maybe.
Oh, nice.
Although I don't think that I maybe would fall into that category even myself. I wouldn't call myself an expert. I can't even solve them, but I'm along for the ride. I have kind of a similar thing. This was one of the first like independent novels with no picture book that I read. And I had seen when I was really young, my sister's high school had done stage adaptation of this and Arsenic and Old Lace all in the same year, their drama club. And so it was a sort of a compare and contrast thing, because one's a comedy, one's not. And she had been helping with like costuming on it, and my mom had been helping. So we were around, and I remember seeing the rehearsals and really loving it. But the older I get, it remains one of my favorites for exactly that reason. It's very unlike the others. There is no, okay, now everyone sit down and I'll sum up, there's no, monologuing from some brilliant mind that's almost superhuman. I spoilers, but there is the epilogue, but it's not really the same, right? And just the tone and the writing, the way the POVs shift from character to character. We get a little of that, I guess, in like Death in the Clouds and Cards on the Table when they're off doing their own, investigations. But I suppose as much as I like Xander's boy, HP, it's refreshing to have sort of a book where you feel like you're on even footing with the major players and the victims of the story. And I love this one for the same reason that it falls into my top 3 fairly evenly with Crooked House and Endless Night. They're all different. They're all very like a departure from all of her other works that at least I'm familiar with.
Absolutely. And how about you, Pat? Where would this fall for you in the Agatha Christie pantheon?
There's a lot to talk about with this one. I find it difficult to say this is a bad book because I think it's easily one of the best written ones that she's done. But personally speaking, it's not for me. For all the reasons that everybody loves it, I probably dislike it. So there's no human warmth in it. It's very dark. I find it extremely pessimistic. And it's just too dark for me. Like even books that are extremely pessimistic, like some of George's stuff that he's written towards in his later books with Game of Thrones, there's still character redemption. There's hope, even against the backdrop of war with all the misery. The characters are still. There's almost an element of tragedy with them fighting against these impossible struggles, but carrying on. But there's nothing in this.
Which is kind of why I love it.
Yeah.
But let's not get too spoilery. We will do, I suspect, more than half of this will be in the spoiler section because it'll be hard to discuss it meaningfully without. But I think it is an interesting discussion to talk about when this was written and how it was received and how Agatha Christie wrestled with the ending and trying to inject that hopefulness in the plays and other adaptations of it. But let's maybe give the listener, a little bit of background. So, my friends, we're going to talk about this. We're going to attempt to talk about the spoiler-free. I'm not entirely sure how that's going to work. For the first part of this episode, as always, we're going to talk a little bit about the historical context in which it was written, any links to the Christie first. I think we do need to talk a bit about the title of the book or the changing title of the book. We're going to give you a bit about the plot and some of the characters and what is regressive or progressive. And then we're going to go into the spoiler part of the discussion quite early on so that we can really talk about, what is going on in terms of choices Agatha Christie made, the tone of it, and how that has changed over the years. So does that sound like a plan, folks? Is that a way of approaching it?
Yes.
Definitely.
It is worth saying, if you've never heard of And Then There Were None, and if this intro has intrigued you, this is the world's best-selling mystery. According to Wikipedia, it has over 100 million copies sold. It's one of the best-selling books of all time, period, regardless of genre. Apparently, it's listed as the 6th best-selling title in any language, including reference works, which I find kind of amazing. And the basic plot of the novel is that 8 people are lured onto a small island off the coast of England, and each of them has received an unexpected invitation, and they get there and there are also 2 members of staff on the island, so there's 10 people on the island, and weather sets in. There is no way to signal to the shore or to get off or on the island, and slowly they start dying, and they realize they're starting to die in accordance with a nursery rhyme that has been pinned up in each of their rooms. And it's based on a very normal English nursery rhyme, which I don't know if it still exists. I don't know, Pat, did you hear this when you were a little kid? But I didn't, but apparently it would have been very common at the time. And it goes
No, I never heard it. So.
Yeah, me neither. But apparently this is how it goes. 10 little soldier boys went out to dine. One choked his little self, and then there were 9. 9 little soldier boys sat up very late. One overslept himself, and then there were 8. 8 little soldier boys travelling in Devon. One said he'd stay there, and then there were 7. 7 little soldier boys chopping up sticks. One chopped himself in halves, and then there were 6. 6 little soldier boys playing with a hive. A bumblebee stung one, and then there were 5. 5 little soldier boys going in for law. One got in chancery, and then there were 4. 4 little soldier boys going out to sea. A red herring swallowed one, and then there were 3. 3 little soldier boys walking in the zoo. A big bear hugged one, and then there were 2. 2 little soldier boys sitting in the sun. One got frizzled up, and then there was 1. 1 little soldier boy left all alone. He went out and hanged himself, and then there were none. So, and then there were none is obviously the current title of this book. And you can tell from that fairy tale that it's really, really, really grim. And that's the kind of the framing device of the story. And that's probably as much as we'll go into in this part of the podcast.
Yeah, not the sort of kids' nursery rhyme I think I would have wanted to hear when I was growing up either.
No.
Not the thing that's going to send you to bed. Yeah.
Well, the original was worse. Because this is the sanitized version of that. Rhyme.
Yes.
This is actually an Irish poem that dates back to 1868.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I thought it was an American poem.
There's two poems that have similar titles now.
Okay, so we should
Reread it.
probably say to the reader
Yeah.
that if you're at all sensitive to racial epithets, this is the time to bug out. There's going to be a lot of reference to the N-word and also to Indians as a pejorative as well. We're not going to use the N. Well, my choice is not to use the N-word. I
No, I
find it
agree
really
with that.
offensive.
Yeah,
So
please
we're
don't.
going to
I think there's
refer
no
to
need
it.
to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're going to refer to it as such. Basically, when this novel was published in November 1939 in the UK, it was called 10 Little N-Words, and the island upon which the characters go to
Oh,
is called N Island. And
I did not know.
apparently it was named after an 1869 minstrel song, which serves as a major plot element.
Oh my God.
Already, the US publisher said this is too racially charged for the US market. And bear in mind that the US market was actually financially far more lucrative for Agatha Christie at this point with the serialization rights. So already they changed the title there to "And Then There Were None." And then they changed the word in the song from 10 Little N-Words to 10 Little Indians. So that was a title used also in some American editions between 1964 and 1986. So I find it fascinating that it wasn't seen as offensive in the UK until the 80s, but immediately in 1939 they were like, "Oh, this is a bridge too far." Hannah, and Bing, what are your thoughts on all of that?
Oh, my life. I thought that you guys were going to talk about it being called 10 Little Indians because,
Yeah.
that's the name of
That
the
was
and
a
that's all.
sanitized version of that title for
I
them.
have never heard that before. I'm so shocked, but can I just say that if you are over in the UK, which abolished slavery and stuff way before the United States did, and even the United States of all damn places is saying, this is not good. I think you've done fucked up a little bit.
Well, I think the
I've never
problem
heard.
is that
Yeah,
I
well,
think the
like
problem is that because we don't have, I mean, we're of course hugely implicated in slavery here and have done a very good job in hiding it, but because it's not as obvious because we didn't have plantations on our own land, I think in a sense there's a kind of complacency about it, and therefore words and things that aren't used in America still get used here because it's almost like it's more distanced. Do you think that's fair, Pat? Like it feels like it's
That
further
makes
away?
sense.
I
Because that one here is definitely like, no, you don't say that, and people that do are disgusting. And I was raised that way, and even my dad, who's from like Texas, even he was raised that way in the 50s.
Yeah, well, I think what Bean has given is a good explanation. It's obviously not a justification, and I think when you're saying we've messed up, Hannah, I think you're right. We're guilty as charged. Certainly, like I don't know how Bina's family would have been, but I do remember my grandparents using words like that when I was a child growing up, and it was seen as normal. And I would say that the first time I became aware of it being a problem would have been when I started listening to rap music in the late 80s and early 90s. And when you're listening to people like Public Enemy talking about things like this, it opens your eyes up. As a white middle-class person, coming from a white background, hanging out with white people 99% of your time, you just don't see this sort of stuff.
I really appreciate it because, like, growing up, I didn't have a problem with the word Indian. Obviously, now we realize how offensive that is, and we call them indigenous peoples, and there's a lot of amends to be made. I mean, and there are other terms, there are other colloquialisms for almost every culture that I can think of that were bandied about pretty casually, especially by people who served in World War II. There were some holdovers that they picked up from World War I, like referring to Italians as a certain word starting with a W, and K
But let me
word.
give you context of England in the 1980s when I was growing up. And for the listener who doesn't know, I am a brown person. And, we were growing up in a time where, a major brand would advertise with gollywogs, so cute little black toys that,
and like we're talking about this in the context of minstrel shows.
Yeah,
And like
yeah.
that was something that my grandparents could relate to. Like they
Yeah.
talked to me about the black and white minstrels,
Yeah, exactly. This was part
and
of
like
culture.
when you're a kid growing up, they're talking to you as if this is something perfectly normal, and they thought it was hilarious.
But
If you look
even
back
more
now,
recently,
and there's a sense of guilt about it. You're like, I didn't realize at the time, and I'm sorry. That's all you
yeah,
can say, really.
you
So.
got to be mortified by it.
I am having such a culture shock right now. I
Right.
never knew that.
So in the case of the U.S., especially when this book was first published during the Second World War, so that's another very important historical context here. This book was published during World War II. I think in the U.S., they very quickly recognized that this was a problem because this word was central to a lot of the racial conflicts that were already happening at that time. It was front and center. Sure, in many parts of American society, of course, obviously, racism was an intense problem, but it was also quite in your face. In the sense that there were lynchings, there were also the Jim Crow laws. There were already a lot of sort of back and forth about that, and there were also African Americans who were standing up against that. The rise of Pan-Africanism and these sort of ideologies. So there's a much stronger social awareness that this is a word that is unacceptable to a large segment of population already back then, which isn't the case in the UK. Which doesn't mean, of
We
course,
had like the first Red Scare and the
yeah,
Communist American Party trying to fight for
that
integration stuff
right, and
right
that
around that.
yeah, and that all of that will come. And again, that's just
And think of
yeah,
the UK at the height of British imperial power, right? And we'll get
right,
onto it with some of the other dodgy stuff in this book. But I
right,
think it's important, and it's why I wanted to do this reread, because Agatha Christie writes from the early 1920s through to the 1970s, and it enables us to see how what was considered okay changes for a mainstream audience. And I think it is fascinating to know that word was not seen as okay for a mainstream audience 35 years earlier than it was seen as not okay for a UK audience.
yeah,
And if that's blowing your mind, then I feel this podcast is doing its job, because it's
It truly
enabling us
is.
to examine why that was the case and why racism is different in the UK than in the US, both pernicious but differently pernicious, and how
I've always
we in
guys
Europe can often have a very condescending attitude towards the States in terms of
it's
race relations, and this shows that we can't do that. Sorry.
that is absolutely wild to me.
Let's do a bit of the historical context. I think as we get through the World War II years, I am going to do a little bit more than usual about what's going on in the world, because I think it is so important for how the books come across and what Agatha Christie is writing and what her publishers are telling her to write, because it will go back and forth during the war as to what audiences will accept. As I said, this was published in November 1939, so it was probably written before the war really began, and certainly before the US was in the war. But let's see what happened between the publication of the prior novel that we read that was published at the start of the year and this novel. In those months, Hewlett Packard was founded. Does that blow your mind that HP is that old? It blew my mind. Amelia Earhart was declared dead. General Franco seized power in Spain. Very relevant to this podcast, Billie Holiday recorded Strange Fruit, and I wonder if that at all influenced the publishers. Batman made his first appearance in Detective Comics
Hooray!
number 27. Enzo Ferrari founded Auto Avio Costruzione, so Ferrari was founded. The
That's very
Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. Hitler, of course, invaded Poland, and World War II for the United Kingdom certainly began on September 3rd. So when people received this book in the UK, we are in World War II. New York Municipal Airport was founded, aka LaGuardia. The first NFL game was televised. Did that feel too early for you? That blew my mind a little bit.
No.
And the
yes.
and the
Oh, but I know television is older than when I think of it rising to popularity.
Yeah. The first nylon stockings went on sale. And shortly after the book was published, again, maybe relevant to the title and the discussion we've had, Gone with the Wind was released. So,
I've got one thing
yep,
to add to your list as well that you've missed.
go then.
Orson Welles did the first dramatic presentation of a Poirot, a
Really?
radio play. Yeah, he did The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, 1939.
Oh, fantastic.
So I just thought it was relevant. I came across it while I was having a look through some of the Wikipedia stuff. It must be true because it was on Wikipedia.
There
So
you go.
Absolutely.
That's a great title.
No, that's brilliant.
But it's a great mix, isn't it, of very modern things like Hewlett Packard and LaGuardia Airport, and then war breaking at, obviously, but also these very big cultural moments, Batman,
Mm.
but Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, that one really stuck out of me because I was like, gosh, if that was in the air, then you can imagine why publishers would
Well,
be really worried about that
yeah, I
title.
thought the Orson Welles one was interesting as well because it shows that Christie is popular in America. Like if they start to dramatize the Poirots, then it's obviously taking off there as well. So.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and I wonder, like, how that affects her life then with royalties and all as well. And if there's influence on her works going forward from a rise in fame like that. The one that stuck out to me in your list, Bina, is the Ferrari, though, in the context of Anthony Marston.
Yeah.
His line, speed's here to stay, boys.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the commercialization, it's kind of interesting because we've seen in the very early books one or two very rich aristocratic young women erratically driving cars, but they're these very strange things. And there's not really other traffic on the road, to now them being quite widespread and the concept of traffic accidents. I think maybe before we get into sort of plot and characters, let's just finish up on the progressive regressive. Obviously, we've done the title, but there is other stuff in here, and I think it is important to remember that this is Britain at the height of empire.
Sorry, I just have, I've got one more question on the title,
Go on,
and
then.
I think it's only something that sort of came along to me in like the last 24 hours, and it has started to make me feel more uncomfortable about Christie than maybe I was expecting to. And she was aware that the American audience had a problem with this title, and she's effectively sat on the change until her death, and it's not happened in the UK until 1985. And I would have thought that she would have been powerful enough to have changed it sooner. And I almost wonder why she didn't.
Well, because for her, it wasn't an offensive word. It was just a descriptive.
Yeah, even though she'd had conversations with her American publishers who explained to her why they wanted it changed, and she'd sort of dismissed that.
It's cognitive dissonance, though, isn't it?
But she will have had a conversation with American publishers who will have sat down with her and said, we're going to change the title of your book, and we're going to remove every reference to the N-word in it and replace it with soldier because it's racially offensive in our country. And she'll have turned around and said, yeah, I'm okay with that, but I'm going to leave it.
I think it's very slippery,
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I hear it as an explanation. I'm not sure it makes me feel any more comfortable with Christie as an author.
I don't think it should. I think Christie is a product of her time. I don't find her particularly more offensive than some of the other people who are also still hailed as even greater heroes than her, like Winston Churchill. Go read Winston Churchill's writings. The man was insanely racist.
Well, again, as somebody who's coming from an Irish background, Winston Churchill is charged with his own series of problems, and it's a different debate, isn't it? So.
Yeah, and coming from different viewpoints, these people can be viewing different lenses, and I think from the lens of, again, cultural sensitivity, no, Agatha Christie, she definitely has issues, and these are issues that should be confronted when you evaluate her, but you also sort of have to take into account what was the environment she grew up with? Why was she the way she is? Not so much condemning her or praising her or anything like that. It's just understanding who she is.
I completely agree. And that's why we do this podcast. And I think you're right, Pat, that we should feel uncomfortable about it. And insofar as it makes us question, I think that's a really good thing. And I always think to myself, are people better or worse than the cultural norm of their time? Because obviously the cultural norm of this time in the UK was not okay. It was a colonial imperialist racist norm. There were people who were obviously worse than the average, like the British Union of Fascists. And there were people who were obviously better and more enlightened and who were lobbying for, civil rights and lobbying against colonialism and who were better. And I think Agatha Christie, why she's interesting to me is she's absolutely on the line. And I think that as her attitudes change, it's a really good reflection of where the absolute mainstream of British thought was. And it just teaches you something about that. And it is shocking. The original title of this book tells you something about where the mainstream of British attitudes towards the N-word were. For me, it is mind-blowing, and it should be mind-blowing. And I think Agatha Christie, we condemn her insofar as we condemn the mainstream, but to me, she's absolutely on the mainstream. And what's really interesting is I've been reading a few mainstream thrillers and detective novels from people like John Buchan that were written in the same era as this, so sort of 1937 through 1940, and they are so much worse. And there's a reason why you can change a few things in Agatha Christie and still have her published today and popular. You would have to totally flipping overhaul some of those other books, which isn't, it's not to make it better about Christie, but it's just to show you, I think the range was pretty big. But, you look at, and that, Gone with the Wind was published this same year in the United States and is also one of the biggest selling books of all time. And I would argue, let's not overestimate how wonderfully enlightened the US publishing industry was to get rid of this title from And Then There Were None in 1939. Because at the same time, they're publishing one of the biggest apologist novels for the kind of the American South and slavery that's ever, and really pernicious kind of depictions of the American South and slavery. There's a whole nother podcast to be done on Gone with the Wind, probably, I think. And just to add to the racist bonfire while we're getting there, one of the characters in this novel says the following about he's been a soldier of fortune in East Africa, which was a colonial British colony, and says, not quite the act of a Pukka Sahib, I'm afraid, but self-preservation is a man's first duty. And natives don't mind dying, They don't feel about it as Europeans do, which I think is probably a good encapsulation of the colonial mindset, which arguably Winston Churchill shared, that there were first-class citizens whose rights and feelings and sensitivities and sympathies were on a certain level. And then there were natives or coloureds or colonials or however you want to refer to them. And these were second-class people, if people at all. They were just, generic natives. And they were like the imperial stormtroopers. They weren't actualized. They didn't have individual opinions. They weren't sensitive. They didn't have sensibility. And they could be killed 10 to a dozen, didn't matter as much as white lives. I think that phrase I just read out really sums up the imperialist mindset. And it's really, to me, that's almost as shocking as the whole concept of the N-word.
Although I think
But again, I think in Christie's defense on that point, I think what she's doing is she's representing the opinion of an unpleasant person.
This was actually a criticism. This was actually a criticism of imperialism.
But I think that if you read Christie's novels, like if you read The Man in the Brown Suit, the one set in South Africa, if you read her novels where there are, imperial citizens who are not white, then you can see that attitude carry over. And I think it's I just wanted to read that as context for the N-word, because I think if you think that she's desensitized to the racism, probably yes, because she's living in part of a world in a country where racism is really embedded into the imperial system. So this American concept of racism probably just feels like, oh, that's just another variety of it, You've got to understand that Britain itself was part of a system just as pernicious, but just differently so.
Well, so I think Christie, in creating the character of Phil Lombard, I think sort of shows that she is critical, or she at least very found disgusting one particular form of imperialism, which is the type of the adventurer, right? The Cecil Rhodes, the Livingstons, those types of individuals, because that's what Lombard is essentially. And these are people who are even at that time still lionized in Britain. So at the very least, she's able to separate these people. Now, I'm not going to say she's just fully enlightened on the issue of imperialism, but she's at least able to pick up, okay, these individuals, they're actually doing very bad things.
Okay, listener, we're now going to go to the spoiler part of this podcast, which is earlier than normal. And we have to, right?
Sorry.
Because I don't think there's any way to really talk about the characters and talk about the adaptations without giving away spoilers. I would seriously, and I'm sure everyone on this podcast would recommend that you read this novel if you haven't already, rather than just listening on, because it is a big sort of concept novel as such. And you should really read it before listening on. It is, I think it's phenomenal.
It is like, if you're feeling a bit low at the time, definitely don't read it. It's not something that's going to cheer you up. It's quite a dark piece. So,
and I will say, if you want to tackle it quickly and get all that you can out of it, but you don't have time to sit and read, the Audible version of this is very good. It's not a radio play. It is the full unabridged work. But the gentleman that does the narration, he uses, different voices for the different characters. Particularly his Wargrave is very good. And it's generally just a very pleasant Audible. If you have the time, you can plow through it in about 6 hours. So.
Okay, folks, it's been a 007 here. I think we're going to draw this part of the And Then There Were discussion to an end, and I will create a second part of this episode that has a full spoiler-filled discussion of the characters, the construction of this amazing plot, and the way in which the adaptations have dealt with the depressing nihilistic tone of this novel. So stay tuned for part 2, which will be published very shortly after part 1 of this episode. Thank you for listening.